Well, the province of Alberta in Canada published a damning report about the COVID pandemic, basically admitting they got it all wrong. The vaccines, the masks, the lockdowns. It's an amazing admission from a government agency. Of course, not everyone wants to hear it, but Dr. Regina Watteel read through it, and she's the author of the book Fisman's Fraud, which exposed how the government in Canada used hate science to put excessive pandemic measures in place, basically tortured them. I spoke to her earlier about the bombshells in this report. Watch. Regina, thank you for joining us on Redacted again. Let us know, as a Canadian, how you feel about this after-action report where the government is basically admitting that there were mistakes and, oops, we made mistakes with your life.
Well, I'm actually very thankful for this report. I'm actually excited because now we have dialogue for the first time. So as you know, Natalie, we've had a lot of censorship in Canada. So this really is the first time that views outside the dominant narrative have been explored in any official capacity. So even though this report was done for Alberta, it does apply to much of Canada. So I'm actually excited.
Now, one of your main assessments is that local provinces had very little power, and most of the driving force came from the federal government, which your amazing book talks about was based on hate science or junk science. So is there this, well, what do you make of that the federal government was in charge and that local provinces had very little power, even if they wanted to base their decisions off of real science?
Well, that was made very clear in this report that it was the federal government in the driver's seat for the province's response. But it also said that Alberta was more than happy to give the federal government the keys, right? So the Alberta government did have its own pre-existing pandemic response plan, and they just tossed that out. And instead, their decisions were ultimately based on federal and international recommendations. And you'll find this is true for other provinces as well. So it begs the question, whose interests are really being served? I was not surprised by that at all. I was happy to see it in the report.
And so how can regulators, make any other decision if there's just this? I mean, that's almost like a king has made the decisions and the people have no choices. Was it like in the United States where certain provinces had maybe better regulations to live under than others?
I think in Canada it was bad and then worse. I mean, it was just awful everywhere, right? So I think like Quebec was extremely bad because they had curfews and they went, they went crazy with their restrictions. Ontario was also very, very bad, but so was BC. So across the board, I think it was not good here. I guess it was a little better in like Alberta. Alberta has always been somewhat better, and that's why my daughter ended up going there during the pandemic because it was just too brutal here in Ontario. For the regulators, though, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead and talk about how regulators were, actively sought to intimidate, threaten, and discipline anyone who went against the consensus.
Right. So when I read the report, there was two very damning chapters, and one basically offered a scathing takedown of Alberta's regulatory bodies. And then we'll talk about the other one later, which is basically the vaccines, when it talked about the safety and effectiveness of the vaccines. So that's where the report hit the hardest. So the regulatory bodies includes bodies like the colleges of physicians and surgeons, as well as other colleges that regulate healthcare professionals. And they have the ability to take away one's license to practice. And so in the report, they kind of came across as like mindless parrots. So I'll quote the report. It said, "They passively accepted and followed other bodies without critically examining the information, thereby perpetuating a false consensus." So the report goes on to say,
that's very damning.
It's very damning. Yeah. They go on to say that any information that they deemed went outside what they thought was the consensus, they called that misinformation, even if that information was correct or accurate. And then the report goes into some depth about talking about their overreach. And here you see that they've acted basically like thugs. So I'll just summarize what the report actually said. It says regulators actively sought to intimidate, threaten, and discipline medical professionals. The chilling effect was pervasive, instilling a climate of fear and caution that deterred providers from utilizing their full expertise. That interfered in the patient-physician relationship and often obstructed healthcare providers from performing their duties in good faith. So that's pretty damning. And the report even says that not only did they fail to protect the public, but they actually made the response worse. So this is scathing.
Yes. And so how can anyone say, well, we didn't know any better. The government told us the truth. We had to behave this way. Anyone in Canada who says this now, you can peel back all the science about masking, about the vaccines, about the science of lockdowns. We've done so in depth. But this is in one fell swoop saying we were coerced into not being able to know what the science would have told us if we were allowed to know it. So I don't know how anyone now can say the federal government was acting in good faith, right?
Oh, yeah, this is pretty bad. I can't see how any of the regulators are going to like this report. It really comes down hard on them. It does, of course, put the federal government in the driver's seat. Yeah, it's pretty scathing. They do make recommendations based on what I just said. They recommend strengthening physician autonomy, and they do recommend putting in some safeguards so that physicians do not suffer politically motivated disciplinary actions, which is what they believe happened.
Right. And so does it discuss the science of masking versus masking mandates?
Yes, it goes through all the things that you guys have been covering for quite some time. Regarding masking, they say that the science did not support mask mandates and that it didn't show that they were effective at all in reducing infections. They talked about non-pharmaceutical interventions such as lockdowns and closures, school closures, and other restrictions. And they said that that was really based on very weak evidence, and it was more like ideologically driven. They said that those measures were ineffective. They had high costs, both socially and economically. They had minimal benefits and diminished returns. So the more you piled on, the less benefits, the more harms.
Yes.
Yeah. They also talked about how natural immunity was downplayed during the pandemic, and they accused Alberta Health of spreading disinformation about how the vaccines had superior immunity. And they said that they even stuck to that disinformation when there was ample evidence that they were wrong. So a lot of the things that you guys have been covering.
Right. It's amazing to see that written here, an admission by province. And so what can be done with something like this? Can you send this up to the federal government and say, you must never do this again and you must admit to it? Because we've seen the tribunals around Justin Trudeau saying his, power grabs were fine. We were fine with it. So, is there any way to run this up the flagpole and get an admission like this from the federal government, especially now that Trudeau is a lame duck?
Well, one thing that the report doesn't get into, Natalie, is how they were able to get away with what they did. Like I said, there was already plans in place and they tossed them aside. And what's to say they won't do the same the next time? So the report doesn't get into that, which is one of the criticisms I've had, because in Canada, one of the biggest issues has been the capture of our judiciary. Okay, so throughout the pandemic, Chief Justice Wagner of the Supreme Court of Canada, he met routinely with Justin Trudeau's Attorney General behind closed doors to talk about how to implement pandemic measures into the courts. And so the Supreme Court even implemented its own vaccine mandates at the same time Justin Trudeau announced mandates for the federal public service. So they were basically on the same page there. And then in the courts, they misuse something called judicial notice routinely. So judicial notice is when the courts deem something to be an undisputed truth. So they would look at statements like the pandemic was a serious threat to all Canadians and the vaccines are safe and effective. And they would deem this as a fact, undisputed. And when you do that, you basically let the government get away with everything.
Right.
There's another, it gets even worse, Natali, that recently the Attorney General was on X and he was bragging that since Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, his government has appointed 825 judges across Canada, and Canada only has 960 appointed judges sitting. So there's an issue because you do see that we don't have an impartial judiciary, and it's really hard to say that they are independent of the executive branch. So, I mean...
Yeah. I mean, I think that was clear when his emergency powers were litigated, that we investigated ourselves and this was fine. So,
right.
You know, the way that the Toronto Sun is covering this is that it was just kind of mismanagement, like bad government. I find that to be a gross understatement of the effect that it had in people's lives. Like you mentioned, you couldn't ask yourself, maybe I'm strong enough to go without this vaccine that they're telling me is so strong. That was not allowed. The masking, the lockdowns. I don't know. Right. Do they mention the Fisman study saying the unvaccinated are a threat to the vaccinated?
They didn't. And actually, when you go through the report, the modeling section, I think that was their weakest section. And they really completely missed the mark. The report failed to acknowledge the role that manipulated statistics and bogus modeling played in the pandemic. So that was mostly used for three things, right? It was used for propaganda, it was used to justify unconstitutional measures, and it was used basically to help authorities skirt accountability. Right? It was like, it's because we were following the science. So the follow the science scheme, that was basically a statistical game that helped them get away with everything. So it really needs to be addressed because they can do that again in the future. So that is one thing I think they really need to look at a little bit more because it played a huge role. And even this task force acknowledged that we're going to see a resurgence in the modeling use when the next emergency or pandemic rolls around. So.
Right. It's so interesting that about 2 weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal published this big wet kiss for Bill Gates, in which he goes on video and says, we're not ready for the next pandemic, and we can't be if we keep reviewing what happened over the last one. So this is something that people like Bill Gates absolutely do not want. We should not be looking backwards. We should just be going forwards. I think I don't need to point out what's extremely wrong with a statement like that, but what's your reaction to it?
Well, obviously, they don't want anybody to review what happened because you and I and all your viewers know that they never really had evidence supporting any of these harsh measures. The evidence was always actually against these vaccines. It was always against these lockdowns and school closures. And so if you review it, that's going to come out. And I think that they're very scared now because of, the administration change in the U.S. Like, we're all very excited. Well, not all of us. The ones who want the truth out are very excited here in Canada because we're hoping, it will kind of come up here as well, that we can ride that wave. So I think they should be extremely worried, right?
Yeah.
And you do see, like you said, there's a lot of letters have gone out now asking Daniel Smith to basically dismiss this report. So they're very afraid.
On what grounds would you dismiss the report?
Well, there's three agencies came out. We had the Alberta Medical Association, the Canadian Medical Association, and the Children's Pediatric Society. They wrote letters, and they basically, the whole thrust is, well, this report goes outside the consensus view, so it's dangerous misinformation. So they really don't have much grounds. They just don't like it, right?
We
no,
don't
it's
like
not an
it,
argument.
So.
we don't like it, so dismiss it. But there's even another guy. There's a fellow here in Canada that was paid millions of dollars to fight misinformation, and he spearheaded a group letter signed by dozens of professionals, including doctors, and they asked also to get rid of this report, to dismiss the report. But when you look at this fellow, his name is Timothy Caulfield, and he is a law professor in Alberta. And he has no real scientific training, but in 2020, he co-founded this organization called Science Up First to fight misinformation and to promote scientific understanding. And he's been getting a lot of money to, basically push the government narrative. So we have a letter spearheaded by him to dismiss this report. So That's been interesting.
Well, you can follow Dr. Regina Watteel on X and get her assessment of this, because she's been peeling back this onion. If you want to search for it yourself, we'll link to it in the newsletter, or you can search for Alberta's COVID-19 pandemic response. It's dated January 28th, 2025. And yeah, like we said, it's damning. Go ahead.
Natalie, I'm not sure if you want to quickly mention the vaccine chapter, because that is getting a lot of play.
Yes, please. Before we go, let's go over that.
That's kind of, because when I read that chapter,
the banger.
Yeah, that is the encore. Because when I read that chapter, I thought, oh my God, heads should roll. And based on the Alberta report, the safe and effective slogan should really be changed to toxic and ineffective. So it's pretty bad. So with this chapter,
wow.
what they do is they present some safety data. They look at the toxicity of the lipid nanoparticles, and they just quickly go through the main issues with the clinical trials, namely that they didn't establish that the vaccines reduced transmission, hospitalization, or death. And that was the case for Pfizer, Moderna, as well as Johnson & Johnson. And so based on this chapter, they recommend three main things. The first one, the biggest one, is they recommend halting COVID-19 for healthy children and teenagers. So a lot of people are very upset about that. The second recommendation is to have full disclosure of all the vaccine risks. And the third recommendation is to have support for the vaccine injured. And even though this report has been out for less than 2 weeks, it has already been filed in a court case for a class action lawsuit on behalf of vaccine injured individuals. So that it is a big deal.
Yeah, right. I mean, they openly admit that the vaccines were not effective in stopping transmission, which was not allowed to be said in the year 2020 and into 2021, citing the Cleveland study that we've talked about several times, that immunity goes down as you get more vaccines. So yes, it's damning. This is, I guess, not new to you and I, but amazing to see a government admitting it.
It is. Like, a lot of people here are happy. I mean, you're going to get pushback, right? I mean, it was, like I said, it said some pretty nasty things about the regulatory bodies. And of course, they're still pushing the vaccines here. So they don't want to hear people asking to halt them. So this is big news.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you so much for bringing it to our attention and breaking it down. I want to remind you that Dr. Regina Watteel was one of the earliest to point out that the Canadian government was using hate science, or basically fake models, to torture the unvaccinated in Canada. I really recommend her book, Fisman's Fraud. And again, you can follow her on X. So thanks for coming back on Redacted. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back. This has been great. Thanks, Natalie.